In 2002, Aileen Wuornos filed a lawsuit against the poor living conditions and harassment she endured on death row. While her petitions received fair responses, they paled in comparison to the inhumane treatment of other death row inmates. Here's how 10 of those inmates were treated in prison. Joe Nathan James Jr. What makes this case a little interesting is the fact that even after a plea by the victim's family to spare James's life during his period of incarceration, he was still gruesomely executed. Before the murder that brought about his eventual demise, James had been in a relationship with a woman named Faith Hall a few years earlier. According to Faith's brother, their relationship lasted about 1.5 to 2 years. However, prosecutors claim that James had become obsessed with Faith after they ended their relationship, and he began stalking and harassing her for several months before her eventual demise. Court records would show that in a year leading up to Faith's death, there were 3 instances of harassment and 1 burglary reported to the police by Faith and her grandmother against James. Now, these reports show James making threats to kill Faith, entering their home, and causing damage, banging on the windows, making persistent phone calls, and loitering in their driveway. August 15, 1994, Faith went shopping with a friend and later returned to that friend's apartment. At this point, they became aware that James was following them. Faith, her friend, and her friend's children quickly sought refuge in the apartment and attempted to secure the door. But despite their efforts, James forcefully entered. Initially, Faith went to de-escalate the situation and protect the children, but her efforts were futile as James fired 3 shots at her while she attempted to flee. And even after Faith collapsed, James callously shot her again. In 1996, during the trial, a Jefferson County jury found James guilty of capital murder and recommended the death penalty, a sentence later imposed by a judge. However, the conviction was overturned after the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals determined that certain police reports had been improperly admitted as evidence by the judge. Subsequently, James had a retrial in 1999, during which he was once again sentenced to death after jurors dismissed defense arguments claiming he was experiencing emotional distress at the time of the shooting. Now, while he was in prison amidst this terrible state of life like maltreatment from prison officials, which involved inhumane handling, unnecessary acts of violence, and sometimes dehumanizing statements, James anticipated his fate, and in this attempt to live out his remaining years peacefully and with a sense of purpose, not joining other inmates in their own acts of violence, he converted to Islam. Now, this decision allowed him to spend his time in solitude while on death row, not minding the harsh living conditions. But it wouldn't last for long. In June and July 2022, James filed lawsuits against Alabama officials, claiming they denied him the option for execution by nitrogen hypoxia. However, his efforts were unsuccessful, and despite receiving forgiveness from the victim's family, his execution was not delayed. July 28, 2022, James's execution, which was scheduled to be concluded by 6 p.m., was allegedly botched, bringing his time of death to 9 p.m. And after his execution, a private autopsy indicated that his arm may have been cut to find a vein, a practice that is totally against the law. John Marian Grant. Now, this is a bit of an intriguing story, as Grant's pathway to death row was committed in prison while he was trying to hatch his plan for a prison break. Born April 12, 1961, Grant had a troubled childhood marked by poverty and instability. He would drop out of school in his teenage years, becoming involved in various criminal activities. He would quickly gain a sweet tooth for crime, gathering convictions for burglary and drug offenses. However, in 1998, while serving 130 years for various crimes, he brutally murdered Gay Carter during an attempted prison escape. Carter, a beloved nurse, was taken hostage and stabbed to death by Grant, who then attempted to flee but was apprehended shortly after. His trial had significant attention due to the shocking nature of the crime and the fact that it happened in a maximum security prison. Despite claiming self-defense and alleging mistreatment by staff, Grant was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 2000. Over the years, Grant's case became this focal point in debate surrounding the death penalty and issues of mental health and prison conditions like the food being served and the attitude of the guards. On the other hand, advocates argued that Grant's troubled background and history of mental illness should be taken into account, while opponents of the death penalty highlighted concerns about the fairness and humanity of capital punishment. Some blamed it on his mental health, while others would blame living conditions in the prison. But regardless, Grant seemed to not be having a good time in there. In 2005, Grant was said to have assaulted a fellow death row inmate, who would later require stitches. To make things worse, there were another 2 incidents in 2008 and 2009, where he fiercely relentlessly threatened corrections officials. These acts laid the foundation for the rejection of his clemency appeal, despite many attempts to secure it, including new ones based on evidence and questions about the reliability of witness testimony. October 28, 2021 was the day the execution was set for John Grant, but he exhibited unusual behavior before the process. Witnesses stated they saw him after being administered with midazolam, having convulsions and vomiting. It wasn't until 21 minutes later that John Marian Grant was pronounced dead. Joseph Paul Franklin. June 8, 1980, Franklin waited on an overpass in Cincinnati, Ohio, intending to shoot the first racially mixed couple that passed by. However, on that chilling evening, two African-American boys did pass by, prompting Franklin to discharge his rifle, resulting in their merciless deaths. As disturbing as that sounds, they were just two of the dozen others Franklin killed in his bid to start a war. Born April 13, 1950 in Mobile, Alabama, Franklin was born in this not-so-peaceful of a home. There was barely any food, and he was physically abused by his mother and siblings. During his teenage years, he became affiliated with the KKK or Ku Klux Klan, which inspired him to start a racial war. Franklin traveled from one state to the other, killing African and Latin Americans unprovoked. He would wait at bus stops and parks, simply waiting for victims to pass by. July 29, 1977, Franklin threw a firebomb on the Beth Shalom Synagogue in Chattanooga, Tennessee, totally destroying it. Thankfully, many left that day, so he only injured a couple of people. And when asked for the reason he wanted to start a war in an interview, Franklin had this to say.
Once I started doing it and showed them how, other white supremacists would do the same thing, follow suit.
Well, fortunately, his plan failed to materialize, but it opened the doors straight to the death penalty. September 1980, Franklin had killed a total of 22 people, and there was a nationwide manhunt for him. He was known to visit blood banks and had conspicuous racial tattoos. On October 28, 1980, they grabbed Franklin. Franklin was arrested on suspicion of perpetuating at least 6 murders in Florida. We could describe his time at Potosi Correctional Center as being in this abyss of desolation. Apart from the food being served, which was like next to nothing, the treatment he received from other inmates before he began living a life of solitude was pretty inhumane. Even the prison wardens weren't left out of that. Franklin couldn't take it anymore, and this made him plan his escape, which was unsuccessful. As a result, in this interview with psychiatrist Dorothy Otno Lewis, he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and unfit to stand trial. But this wouldn't stop the government from putting him on death row until 2013, when it was finally time for execution. Now, this might have been delayed a couple of times, first due to the EU exporting a ban on drugs to be used for the execution, and then due to the stay of execution, which is a court order temporarily suspending execution, which was granted twice, based on Franklin's claim that he was too mentally incompetent to be executed. But on November 20th, 2013, he was taken out by lethal injection. According to witnesses, he displayed no signs of pain. He didn't even have a final written statement, nor did he utter a single word in that chamber. Following the administration of that injection, he blinked several times, breathed heavily, and swallowed hard before being officially pronounced dead. Robin Lee Rowe. Family, they say, is everything, especially when someone's going through a crisis. But for Robin Lee Rowe, family was just a mean to an end, especially when there's a life insurance policy totaling over $250,000. February 10th, 1992, Rowe's life took a dark turn when a fire engulfed her home in Bellevue, Idaho, killing her husband, Randy, and 2 children, Joshua and Tabitha. Suspicions arose due to Robin's inconsistent statements and behavior. It wasn't until much later that investigators discovered evidence suggesting that the fire was deliberately set. It was alleged by the prosecution after an investigation that Rowe set the fire to collect insurance money totaling over $250,000 and to escape her troubled marriage. During the trial, prosecutors showed forensic evidence and testimonies implicating Rowe was part of that arson killing her family, but she relentlessly maintained her innocence of that crime. In March 1993, Rowe was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and arson and was sentenced to death on December 16th by Judge Alan Schwartzman. To many people, it was the right call because she was a murderer. On the other hand, she had support from advocates who did believe in her innocence. or just opposed capital punishment. You could say her life in prison is like living in hell, as the four walls were testing her mental health. Now, the prison warden had to isolate her because she was violent. She'd also been excluded from educational and employment programs, and sharply restricted in terms of visitation and exercise, spending as many as 23 hours a day alone in her cell. And that's pretty outrageous if you think about it. In 2011, Rose's appeal for her sentence was dismissed by U.S. District Court Judge B. Lynn Windmill, and at this point in time, she remains the only female death row inmate in Pocatello Women's Correctional Center in Pocatello. Charles Manson.
You know, if I wanted to kill somebody, I'd take this book and beat you to death with it, and I wouldn't feel a thing.
Many of you have heard this name before, as he's been described as the devil in human form. This man would form somewhat of a cult with the intent of inciting a race war, but only if he knew what the future had in store for him. Born November 12, 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, Charles Manson's early life was pretty marred by tumultuous upbringing. Now, his mother was barely old enough to have a child at that time, and would also be involved in armed robbery, which led her straight to prison. Growing up in that setting, it was no surprise that by the time he was 9, he was breaking the law, constantly ditching school and stealing. His appetite for crime was magnified throughout his childhood, resulting in stints in reform schools and facilities for troubled boys. However, he was just getting started. By 1956, Manson had received his initial adult prison sentence, kicking off an 11-year pattern of imprisonment and subsequent release. Now, that would continue until 1967, when at the age 32, he was released from this facility in Washington State. What the world didn't know at that time was that he was on the verge of evolving from a habitual criminal into the infamous leader of a cult called the Manson family. Upon his release, Manson found a niche within San Francisco's counterculture movement. Desiring attention, he would turn into the self-styled spiritual guru, attracting vulnerable young women seeking a sense of belonging. And after gathering all these unsuspecting women, Manson and his newly acquired followers embarked on a journey along the West Coast, before finally settling down at LA's Spawn Ranch in 1968. Here he would spread around his spiritual beliefs, driven by a lot of drug consumption and dreams of entering the music scene, but initially this would draw no objections. However, when Manson reverted to his past behaviors, it led to violence, culminating in murder. In July 1969, the initial victim, musician Gary Hinman, succumbed to the Manson family during a failed robbery attempt. They would continue and head on to actress Sharon Tate and 4 others. This was succeeded by a spree of killings that didn't escape the watchful eye of law enforcement. October 1969, after evading authorities for 2 months, Manson and his family were arrested on suspicion of car theft and charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. It was during his indictment that his insane theory of a race war was revealed. According to one member of the family, for a long time, Charles had preached about an impending race war of significant magnitude. He told them that black people would begin to attack and kill white people, and while this was happening, the Manson family would hide away in caves. Once the violence had subsided, they would emerge to rule all those who remained. Charles also interpreted the Beatles' White Album as prophesizing this race war. I know, it's pretty scary, but on January 25, 1971, a jury found Manson and his followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Von Houten, guilty of all charges. They were initially sentenced to death, but it was commuted to life when California abolished the death penalty the following year. In 1984, while he was in prison, Manson suffered severe burns after an inmate poured paint thinner on him and set him on fire simply because Manson objected to his Hare Krishna chants and verbally threatened him, leading to him getting relocated to California State Prison Cochran. From this prison, he was found guilty of drug trafficking and transferred to Pelican Bay State Prison. Manson would spend his remaining days at the California State Prison, where he died of natural causes on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83. Thomas Eugene Creech. Many inmates on death row typically lead solitary lives and exhibit good behavior in hopes of receiving a reduced sentence or eventual freedom. But that wasn't the case for Thomas Eugene Creech. He committed the gruesome murder of a fellow inmate during his incarceration. Born September 9, 1950, in Hamilton, Ohio, his upbringing was marked by parental discord, divorce, and a father's mysterious death, intertwined with violence. He would begin his life of crime after he ran away from his hometown and became a drifter, traveling cross-country frequently. This led him straight to prison in 1969, but he was later paroled in 1971. His marriage to Thomasine Loren White of Boise, Idaho at that time did him no good, as she became his partner in crime. and after being taken to a psychiatric hospital in Salem, Oregon, she died after taking her own life. In 1973, Creech violated parole by stealing 13 cartons of cigarettes in Portland. He was apprehended and charged with theft, and these charges were eventually cleared after a psychiatric evaluation. And to add some kind of meaning to his life, he would briefly work as a sexton at a church before moving to Idaho. November 6, 1974. Creech and his friend Spaulding decided to go hitchhiking in Idaho from Lewiston south to Donnelly, where they were picked up by two men, whom Creech fatally shot with his rifle and buried. In a bid to hide the crime, he went back home, gave his rifle to Gene Hilby, whom he was befriending at that time, to help him dispose of the gun. How could she have known this was a murder weapon? 2 days later, Creech and Spaulding were arrested in Glens Ferry for the murders, along with suspicions of other crimes. Rumors went around saying Creech was sending death threats to the newly elected Colorado Senator, Gary Hart, but after some investigation, he was eventually cleared of that charge. This man was held in Valley County Jail before being transferred to Ada County in Boise for security reasons. Creech, in his mischievous ways, attempted to take his life post-arrest and faced legal complexities involving murder allegations and confessions. But despite confessing to numerous murders, many of them were discredited. He was convicted of 5 of them, maintaining innocence in some cases. Eventually, he was given the death sentence, but his execution was delayed due to pending appeals. A ray of hope came for Creech as one attorney sought to have his death sentence commuted to life imprisonment, which he actually did, following the Greg v. Georgia ruling. While incarcerated, he worked as a janitor, despite the protests of 2 prosecutors who warned the wardens that he still posed a threat, even to other inmates. That fear came to pass because on May 13, 1981, Creech murdered fellow inmate David Dale Jensen, which obviously took him right back to the death sentence. On February 28, 2024, his execution was set to proceed. However, 1 hour past the scheduled 10 a.m. execution time, it was announced that the medical team had been unsuccessful in setting up an IV line for the lethal injection. Eventually, the execution was called off, and Creech was escorted back to his cell. Paula R. Cooper. The condemnation of the then 15-year-old killer, Paula Cooper, attracted an international uproar, especially in Europe, including a condemnation of her sentence from Pope John Paul II. But no one expected that her life would come to an unexpected end. Born August 25, 1969, Cooper was known as a victim of abuse who had attended 10 different schools, even at the time of the murder. She was known to be a runaway, a burglar, and committed several other petty crimes that may have slipped past the radar. On May 14, 1985, the day of the tragic incident, Cooper, along with 3 of her friends, Denise Thomas, Karen Corder, and April Beverly, skipped school to go drink and smoke weed before visiting a neighbor, Helka, an elderly woman, apparently to ask about Bible lessons. We don't know what they were smoking, but as they got up to Pelka, one of the girls struck her with a vase, after which she cut her arms and legs. As if that wasn't enough, Cooper stabbed her 33 times in the chest and stomach with a foot-long 30-centimeter butcher knife. The girls looked around for jewelry and eventually stole $10 and the keys to Pelka's 1976 Plymouth. Subsequently, Cooper and the squad was arrested, and the girls were all given 25 to 60 years for their role in the crime. Cooper, on the other hand, brought about a little question of her guilt in the case. Should she be given the same sentence if she was considered the ringleader? It was her idea that led to the eventual demise of Pelka. Now, she was taken to the juvenile center, but her tendency for violence made her attack the guards, which would eventually make her move to the county jail, where she would brag about her crime, and even said that she was going to do it again if given the chance. In a bid for a lesser sentence, her public defender urged her to plead guilty. During the trial, Lake County Deputy Prosecutor James McNew sought the death penalty, painting Cooper as an irredeemable being. The defense revealed her traumatic past of abuse and neglect as possible reasons for the crime committed, and despite support from global figures and media attention, Cooper was sentenced to death. She was then taken to the Indiana Women's Prison in Indianapolis, where she was kept on death row. Things didn't go down well for Cooper, as she was only treated badly by fellow inmates, also being sexually assaulted by several guards, according to reports. Alas, amid the scandal and legal developments, including legislative change and a Supreme Court ruling, her sentence was eventually commuted to life imprisonment in 1989. Cooper pursued an education in prison, and with good behavior, her 60-year sentence translated to a release in 2013. But unfortunately for her, on May 26, 2015, she brought about her very own demise as she took her own life. Aileen Wuornos.
I'm leaving. I'm glad. Thanks a lot, society, for railroading my ass.
May 31st, 1990, Aileen Wuornos brutally murdered Charles Edmund Karskadin. She was working prostitution on the highways of Florida, which she shot and robbed 7 individuals. And even though she was considered a serial killer, her story seems to be quite fascinating. February 29th, 1956. Rochester, Michigan. Aileen Wuornos was born, with her mother at the age of 16 and her father 18. Less than 2 months before she was born, her mother had filed for a divorce, making Aileen never meet her father. And at the age of 4, Aileen's mom left her at her grandparents' house and disappeared. These grandparents were alcoholics, adding another layer of complexity to her already troubled upbringing. So she got involved in activities at school in exchange for cigarettes, drugs, and food. Outside of school, she would engage in these same activities with her brother. Her grandfather also sexually abused her, while a family friend sealed it off by getting her pregnant. Several months following the birth of her son, she left school and arranged for his adoption. Then a year later, her grandfather evicted her from the house, forcing her to live in the woods near her former residence and sustain herself by engaging in prostitution. During her teenage and adolescent years, Aileen attempted to take her own life 6 times, including one time where she actually shot herself in the stomach. Following these attempts, Aileen would engage in various offenses, but was never formally sentenced for any particular crime until November 30th, 1989. She took the life of her first victim, a man named Richard Charles Mallory, whom she claimed raped and sodomized her after driving her to a secluded area for services. She went on to kill 6 other men in the space of 12 months, and also claimed that the police were aware of her murders, but they would never arrest her, at least not at that time. January 9th, 1991. Aileen was apprehended under the guise of having an outstanding warrant. She stood trial on January 14th, 1992, was convicted, and subsequently received a death sentence. In 2002, on death row, Wuornos accused prison staff of mistreatment, alleging food tampering, and harassment to push her towards taking her own life. She complained of vigorous strip searches, tight handcuffing, and poor living conditions. Surprisingly, she boycotted showers and meals under certain officers. Her attorney would even help her emphasize the desire for humane treatment until her execution. Now, days before that execution, she released a statement that read, "I killed those men, robbed him as cold as ice, and I'll do it again too. There's no chance of keeping me alive or anything because I kill again. I have hatred crawling through my system. I'm so sick of hearing this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." On October 9th, 2002, Aileen was executed by lethal injection, but before entering the execution chamber, she said,
"Nick, this is the last time I'm going to say it. You have to kill Aileen Wuornos because she'll kill again."
Blanche Taylor Moore. A cold-blooded killer, Blanche Taylor Moore, aka the Black Widow, has been sitting on death row for 31 years. However, in that time, she'd exchanged her killer instincts for something new, something no one saw coming. Born February 17th, 1933 in Concord, North Carolina, Moore was said to have grown up in this religious home. Her father was an ordained Baptist minister, but he was also a womanizer and alcoholic who, she later claimed, forced her into prostitution to pay off his gambling debts. Moore's early life would be a mixture of the scripture and explicit content, and even though we can trace her criminal history back to the late 80s, her murderous activities likely began much earlier. In 1986, suspicions arose around Moore when her boyfriend Raymond Reed fell seriously ill and later died under mysterious circumstances. Investigations showed traces of arsenic in the system, which made Moore a prime suspect. This led to her arrest and conviction in 1990, and in 91 she was eventually given the death sentence. Further investigation into her past unveiled a chilling pattern. It was discovered that many people close to her had died mysteriously. All seemed to be consistent with arsenic poisoning. These individuals included her first husband, James Taylor, who died in 1973, her father, Parker Kaiser, who died in 1966, her mother-in-law, and the attempted murder of her second husband in 1989 was not left out, upon which she was ultimately charged as well. Unlike many inmates in here, Moore decided to avoid trouble and make good use of her time. Despite the inhumane style of feeding and the method of socialization from other inmates, despite the horrendous food and the way other inmates talked to her, she would use this time to write her music and poetry. However, health complications would make her go through chemo and radiation therapy. Now, she's currently incarcerated at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women, where she's one of the few women death row inmates and the oldest. Christa Gail Pike. Jealousy is an emotion that creates various ends, from different reactions to it. For some, it ends with an emotional or mental breakdown, while for the likes of Miss Pike here, it either takes you to life in prison or your very own demise. Born March 10, 1976, to Carissa Hansen and Emil Glenn Pike in Beckley, West Virginia, Pike's troubled upbringing and tumultuous adolescence laid the groundwork for her descent into crime. In 1995, at the age of 18, she became involved with people connected to the Job Corps program in Knoxville, Tennessee. It was there that she would get into a relationship with Daryl Shipp. However, Pike became jealous of her Job Corps classmate, 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer, who she thought was trying to steal her boyfriend from her, thereby leading to a violent confrontation. January 12, 1995. Pike, Shipp, Peterson, and Slemmer signed out of the dormitory and proceeded towards the woods, where Slemmer was told they wanted to make peace by offering her some marijuana. Once there, Pike and Shipp attacked Slemmer, beating her severely while Peterson acted as a lookout. Pike then went on to kill Slemmer by stabbing her multiple times and ultimately carving a pentagram into her chest with a box cutter. The brutality of that crime shocked the nation, and Pike's trial became a media sensation. During the trial, she would show little remorse for her actions, displaying a callous and unrepentant demeanor. She was eventually convicted of first-degree murder in March 1996, and then sentenced to death, making her at that time the youngest woman on death row in the U.S. Despite numerous appeals and attempts to overturn her sentence, including claims of ineffective legal representation and mental health problems, Pike remained on death row for years. Now, as we see, some of these people like to live a life of solitude, maybe even take up a new religion. But others, like Christa Pike here, allow the harsh environment of incarceration to get to them. On August 24, 2001, Pike, with alleged assistance from inmate Natasha Cornett, attacked and attempted to strangle fellow inmate Patricia Jones with a shoestring and nearly succeeded in choking her. Pike was convicted of attempted first-degree murder on August 12, 2004. Then in March 2012, due to maltreatment from fellow inmates and prison officials, Pike had made an escape plan involving corrections officer Justin Heflin and this New Jersey man named Donald Kohut. Too bad for her, she was caught. Nonetheless, as of March 10, 2024, the state still doesn't have an execution date for Pike. And if it goes through, she's going to be the first woman to be executed in Tennessee in roughly 200 years.